My office alleges that these acts, amongst others, demonstrate an intention to permanently remove these children from their country, Khan said. We must ensure that those responsible for alleged crimes are held accountable and that children are returned to their families and communities. We cannot allow children to be treated as if they are the spoils of war. This story around Vladimir Putin having an arrest warrant put out for him. So before we talk about the arrest warrant, though, we have to talk about this. So yesterday, as I was traveling to Lviv, I saw on Twitter from the AFP news agency, their Twitter account, that Vladimir Putin, that Russia had been accused of a war crime by a UN probe, specifically the crime of the mass kidnapping of children. That by Russia kidnapping tons of children and deporting them back to Russia, that is a war crime. Now, what Russia will say in response to that mass kidnapping of children, literally trying to steal Ukraine's future because the youth are the future, is that, well, Ukraine's part of Russia, so it isn't kidnapping, it isn't deportation. That's their argument, and that's what they're going to say, because they have, in their own constitutional system, in their own legal system, they have annexed, quote-unquote, Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, all of the territory that they have some control over in one way or another, even if it's just like an inch of territory. And so in their mind, these territories are no longer part of Ukraine. They're part of Russia. So the children there are not Ukrainian children, they're Russian children. So if they want to take them and deport them and move them all the way to Siberia out of Ukraine, that's completely in their right in Russia's mind. They can do whatever they want with them. That's the Russian mindset on this. Now, obviously, that's not how the international community views it. That's not how Ukraine views it. They see this as the stealing of children. And this is not how the UN views it, now that the UN has done a probe into it. Now, I have personally been very critical of how the UN has handled this war. I don't think they have done enough probes. I don't think they have done enough investigations. I think they should be more involved. But this is a pleasant sign from the United Nations for them to take this issue seriously. Because when I would talk to people about this mass kidnapping of children, which my friend Pavel, who's a Polish aid worker and reporter friend of mine, who's doing a massive story about this very issue, I would tell people about the stories of children being hidden in closets, being hidden in people's attics, being hidden in people's homes, in the homes of, people who work at orphanages. So the Russian soldiers, before they pull out of an area, don't steal them all, just put them in the back of a truck to never be seen again by their friends and family. They would hide them. They would hide the children. And when I would say these stories, I would get looks from people like, get the fuck out of here. What do you mean? Get out of here. Because they start getting images in their head of like Schindler's List, of like Anne Frank hiding in the attic. And they're like, nah, that isn't real. Get out of here. But the more and more evidence that has come forward it has gotten to such a level that the UN can no longer ignore it, that the international community can no longer ignore it. Ukraine has been yelling from the mountaintops about this issue for a while. But now the UN no longer ignores it, and they're not only acknowledging that this mass crime is going on, but they're also now saying that it's a war crime. That is designated as a war crime, and what they're doing is not legal. Despite Russia's claims as their territory, the international community does not agree with that. Not whatsoever. I think there was even a story about
Burns is
Ukraine orphanages.
Morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
Orphanages hide. I wonder if I can find it quick, because this article was crazy, and I really recommend. Here it is right here. This is from the Washington Post. This is an insane article, extremely depressing to read. This article is about how in Kherson, which was the territory that Russia occupied for a while before pulling out, orphanages would actually hide the Ukrainian children from Russian soldiers. When the Russians come to the orphanages in order to steal the children, they would hide them in different parts in the building, and many times even hide them in their own homes, literally taking them out of the orphanages so the Russian soldiers wouldn't steal the children. I know this is hard for people to believe because this is so comically evil. This is so unbelievably horrific, but it is going on. Let's read a little bit of the article before we move over to what the International Criminal Court is doing in response to this UN probe. First off, Tsunami State, thank you so much for the tier 1 of being sub for 7 months. Welcome back to Ukraine, Dylan. Hello from a small town. And, oh God, you did that on purpose. Zoltanasha. I swung and I missed probably, but I did my best. I also saw somebody earlier wishing me hello from central Ukraine. So hello from western Ukraine. Let's read a little bit of this article before we move over to an arrest warrant being placed on Vladimir Putin in reaction to this. 15-year-old Katya remembers rushing out of the orphanage just in time, minutes before the Russians arrived to take the other children away. It was October 19th, and the occupiers of their village outside Kherson were preparing to leave. The Russians had first shown up at the orphanages here a month earlier in armored military vehicles with 15 children in tow. Ukrainian orphans they had whisked away from the village in the previous occupied Mykolaiv region, about 35 miles north. And so what this is also indicating is when the Russians would pull out of an area, when they're about to retreat, what they start doing is they start looting. Now, this has been shown in many different ways, not only the looting of like washing machines and dryers, microwaves, TVs, radio players, like any type of technology, any type of valuables, gold, rings, money, and all of that. Cars, in many occasions, they'll steal cars. Sometimes they'll even steal cars from each other, and I'll talk about that later in today's stream. But that looting also extended to Ukrainian art, with over 2,000 different pieces of Ukrainian art and history being stolen from Ukraine, including over 2,000-year-old Scythian gold. They looted this from Ukrainian museums, literally stealing the physical history of Ukraine that took thousands of years to build. But not only are they stealing that culture, they're also stealing Ukraine's future. When they would pull out of an area, once it was clear that they weren't going to be able to hold on to something, they go to the orphanages, they take as many children as they can, and they get out of there. They don't talk to them about like, hey, children, do you want to stay here? Or, hey, child, do you have any friends and family? Or, what's best for that isn't put into consideration. They just take as many children as they can, and they skedaddle. Why do they do this? Well, it's kind of hard to imagine why anybody would do something so evil, but I have one justification that's been riding on the back of my head for a bit now. Russia's going through a massive demographic crisis due to the fact that they can't get all these, get the people to, have children. Instead of, creating a more prosperous society where maybe they invest a lot more in childcare or invest a lot more in trying to get people to have children's and tax benefits and stuff like that, they have decided that it would be much easier for them to just steal another people's children and have them solve their demographic crisis. This is also particularly evil because Ukraine is also going through a demographic crisis, so they're worsening another nation's demographic crisis, as well as stealing their children in order to try to solve their own demographic crisis. That's my personal theory. Anyway, let's continue with the article. But the Russians didn't know that about a dozen other local children, including Katya, were also living in the same quarters. Each time the Russians came, the teachers would hide the children in their rooms, Katya recalled, for nap time. Now, the teachers feared the Russians would find those children and take them too. So a small group of staff members came up with a secret plan to sneak the children out and hide them in their own homes. As Ukraine liberates towns and villages previously occupied by Russian forces, residents have shared numerous stories of Ukrainian children being taken away. Where the children are ultimately taken and the circumstances of their movements are often difficult to confirm, but many of the children appear to be like Katya and her peers, orphans or children with learning disabilities who were already in public care. They are the youngest and most vulnerable Ukrainians, and wartime for them has been especially perilous. One of the teachers at the orphanages had heard stories like these in the nearby Kherson city, a regional capital occupied by the Russians in early March. She said she had heard dozens of newborns taken from the nursery in the city and 6 college students forcibly evacuated from their dorms. She was not going to let this happen to the children in her charge. This then goes on to talk about how they hid children for days. They would try to keep them away from Russian soldiers, hoping that the Russians don't spot them because the children might be stolen away. So obviously, the UN did an investigation into this, and they have condemned it. They have said it's a war crime. Many other international organizations have said it's a war crime. Ukraine has been calling this a war crime for a while as people have tried to ignore it. But now, as the UN probe has exposed this and named it on an international level, this this nonpartisan group has come out to designate this as a war crime. The ICC has decided they are no longer going to ignore this, and they're going to have a repercussion from this. And this repercussion has gotten a lot of giggles from people on Twitter, and has gotten a lot of like, haha, that Lamau, that's so funny, from people online as people are joking about it. But the reason why I'm starting this story with this is because even though it is a little silly, the image in our mind of like an ICC like official going to Moscow, knocking on the door saying, "Can you please turn over Vladimir Putin? We would like to arrest him." While that image is silly, the reason why this is being done is not silly. This is a very, 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 very serious crime that has real life repercussions for thousands of Ukrainian children and will traumatize them, and has traumatized them for the rest of their life. So I wanted to start the story with this part so you have a background for this, so you know, while even though the image of an ICC official going to arrest Vladimir Putin or issuing this arrest warrant is silly, considering that it's not going to happen. He's not going to be arrested, at least not anytime in the near future, or as politics are as they are. We would have to see basically the dissolution of the Russian state as it exists today for that to happen. The reason this is happening is extremely serious. And so that moves on to the second point in the story, which is that the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin over these alleged war crimes. Specifically, what is named in this is the kidnapping of Ukrainian children from Ukraine. Arrest warrant issued for Russian leader and his children rights commissioner for unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children. The International Criminal Court in The Hague has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin for overseeing the abduction of Ukrainian children, sending Russia another significant step on the path to becoming a pariah state. And granting the request for warrants by the ICC prosecutor, a panel of judges agreed that there were reasonable grounds to believe Putin and his children's rights commissioner bore responsibility for the unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children. The warrants are the first to be issued by the ICC for crimes committed in the Ukraine war, and is one of the rare occasions when the court has issued a warrant for a sitting head of state, putting Putin in the company of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi and Sudanese president Omar al-Bashir. Well, I'm sure Gaddafi is sitting pretty right now. I'm sure Putin has nothing to worry about. Gaddafi was toppled and killed, oh wow, big surprise, months after his warrant was announced. Bashir was also ousted and is currently in jail in Sudan, though he has yet to be transferred to The Hague. Putin is likely to evade justice in the near future. Russia does not recognize the court's jurisdiction and insisted on Friday it was not affected by the warrants. But the Russian leader will face limits on his freedom of travel to the ICC's 123 member states, further deepening his isolation. So, if you're a member of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that means you give access to ICC prosecutors and officials to go into your country to arrest people who have been found guilty of things like war crimes. So let's say Omar al-Bashir escaped from prison and he went to, I don't know, Sweden. If he went to Sweden, the ICC would go to Sweden and be like, dog, Omar al-Bashir is in your country. They would be like, I hear you, Top G. And then they would let them in, and then they would arrest Omar al-Bashir. So even though, again, the image of like Putin in Brussels getting arrested by the ICC is very funny, technically, this is now a concern he needs to take into consideration. That if he goes to a country that falls under the ICC's jurisdictions, according to the rules of the ICC, that country would have to give them access to go arrest Vladimir Putin. I am a big critic of the fact that Russia is not in the ICC, but I also say this from a semi-position of hypocrisy, not personally, but more nationally, because the United States is also not in the ICC. And this is something that I'm very critical of the American government for not being a part of, because I believe in the creation of international norms that they tell states, hey, don't kidnap another country's children. I think that's a very basic thing countries can do. But sadly, the United States not only is not a signatory to the ICC, we actually have something called the Hague Invasion Act. Now, what that's kind of like the street name for it, not the official name, but it's easier to remember that way. What the Hague Invasion Act basically said, if you were to boil it down, this was put into law during the Bush administration. Not the first Bush, the second Bush. You know, the one that did a dank meme in Iraq. Anyway, he introduced this law, which basically says that if the ICC was to, like, let's say, arrest an American soldier for, like, I don't know, killing, like, 20 villagers or something, America could invade Belgium. It's not a joke. I know it's a serious law, but it's very silly. We're working in a lot of hypotheticals right now. It's a very silly law that if they were to arrest an American soldier, we could end up like invading Belgium in order to liberate, quote unquote, liberate them from the oppression of this international organization and then bring them back to the United States. What the United States has said is that, you know, blah, 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 sovereignty. I think it's a bad argument. I think that having all countries fall under some level of international norms on how you treat civilians, how you treat human beings and human rights and other nations that you go to war with, like in Russia's case, I think that is the bare minimum a state should do. But to be clear, the Bush administration did say that don't worry about it, we'll prosecute them on our own, which is never a good argument. Even if he's telling the truth, you should never trust the country in question to prosecute its own soldiers and its own army personnel for war crimes committed in other countries. There are probably a lot of people who committed war crimes in places like Vietnam who are not sitting on the inside of a jail cell, who possibly under different circumstances, if we were part of something like the International Criminal Court, could maybe today be sitting on the inside of a jail cell. So I just wanted to take this moment to move out of the way and to acknowledge the fact that my home country, the United States, is also not a member of the ICC, meaning if we were doing something similar to what Russia is doing right now by invading Ukraine, we could also similarly avoid justice if our own legal systems did not step in a way to stop it. I would hope that the American legal system would step in the way to stop it, but I am not confident enough in the American justice system, again, because it's from the American perspective, not the perspective of the people being invaded or the territory captured, and so I just don't trust it. Anyway, let's continue with the article. In deciding to issue the warrants, the ICC pre-trial chamber of judges considered keeping the warrants secret, but decided that making them public could contribute to the prevention of further commission of crimes. Yo, I saw some people talking about this. Could you imagine if they just kept this secret until Putin walked into a country that was under the ICC's jurisdiction, and then they just nabbed him? Could you imagine? They just nab him? And they're like, oh, sorry, we forgot to tell you, you're wanted by the International Criminal Court for kidnapping Ukrainian children. And, you know, it would be obviously Russian, like it would be a crazy international incident. It's something that I don't even think is honestly something unprecedented when you think about it. But I think, Belgium could make the based argument of, well, you kidnapped the Ukrainian children, why can't we nab you off the street? I think that would be pretty based really. That would be awesome. I'd love to see that. But obviously, they have avoided that scenario, and they have informed them of this crime, which I'm hoping is going to put a bigger magnifying glass on this crime, meaning that the children who have been forcefully deported, I hope that they have an opportunity to come back to Ukraine, and that this stops Russia from continuing to do this. Do I trust the Russians to reverse this decision and start sending these Ukrainian children back to Ukrainian adoption centers to be cared for the nation that they were born in? Not really. I don't trust the Russians as far as I could throw them, but I do think this was the right decision, because I think the immediate protection of these children is the most important thing. It is unclear how many children have been taken from Ukraine by Russian forces. Last month, the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab published a report alleging that at least 6,000 children from Ukraine have been sent to Russia for re-education camps in the past year. In a statement on Friday, the ICC prosecutor, Karin Khan, oh, by the way, like the reason they call it re-education camps is what they do is they take these children, they then put them in facilities where they basically teach them, you're not Ukrainian. You were never Ukrainian. That's a lie. You're actually Russian. You've always been Russian, but it's your Nazi, Jewish, gay, trans, the Pokemon, whatever LGBTQ plus government had lied to you and told you you're Ukrainian when you're really just you're in Russia's hinterland. You're truly Russian. They're also doing this in a lot of occupied territory where they've completely overhauled all of the local educational curriculum, taking all of the Ukrainian books and in many instances literally just burning them in piles and introducing new educational material, which paints Ukraine as like basically a breakaway region of Russia. Khan said many of the children have been put up for adoption in Russia and that Putin had issued a decree expediting the conferral of Russian citizenship onto children, making them easier to adopt. There was actually one piece of footage. I don't think I have it on hand, but I saw a piece of footage where there was somebody talking. There was a woman talking to Vladimir Putin during one of these like state media interviews where they're like, Putin, why are you so smart? Putin, why are you so handsome? You know, like the softball questions you're going to get with Russian state media. And during that interaction, she bragged to Putin that she had adopted some of the Ukrainian children that were looted and kidnapped and human trafficked out of Ukraine into Russia. That she was willing to brag about committing, again, a war crime on international television for that the whole world can go and watch online. Unbelievably bold for her, unbelievably horrific. My office alleges that these acts, amongst others, demonstrate an intention to permanently remove these children from their country, Khan said. We must ensure that those responsible for alleged crimes are held accountable and that children are returned to their families and communities. We cannot allow children to be treated as if they are the spoils of war. There are reasonable grounds to believe that Mr. Putin bears individual criminal responsibility for the aforementioned crimes, the ICC judge's statement said, adding that he both committed the acts directly and failed to stop others from doing so. Now, I do want to say that I've heard some people make the argument, and this, again, the vast majority of people are not arguing this, but I have seen some people, mostly sympathizers with the occupiers, making the argument, no. They are simply taking these children and removing them from a war zone to keep them safe. But that's not true. They're taking them and then they're starting to brainwash them. They're starting to tell them, you're not Ukrainian, you're Russian. Learn Russian. Don't learn Ukrainian, learn Russian. And then they're adopting them out to Russian families. So they're not just removing these children to keep them safe. They're stealing them. They're stealing these children. They're stealing the future of Ukraine, a country already dealing with a demographic crisis, in order to supplement their own population and to further their hardcore Russian nationalistic agenda. Anyway, let's move on to the Kremlin's response. Wait, 1 second. We've got a fantastic message in chat. I wanted to read it. It got restricted from a likely ban evader. Let's read it. Let's read this lovely message. This seems to be from one of the people who supports stealing children. Let's read it. Russia will never break apart. You shithead, dipshit cuck, typical libtard, wishful thinking, 80 tanks that are crap and can be destroyed by RPG and drones, and Russia can eliminate them in 1 to 2 days, but they will go into Ukraine in 4 to 12 months. Ukraine and Israel, only Nazi states. You call yourself anarchist, but you support state violence and Nazi battalions, you hypocrite dipshits. Okay, I don't even, okay, half of that is impossible to even decode what he's saying. Also, I'm not an anarchist. And lastly, we're talking about children being stolen, and your main priority right now is to talk about tanks going kaboom. I think that shows your priorities, and you have no interest in liberating people. Anyway, continue. If somebody wants to ban them, I don't care. I hate freedom of expression when it applies to supporters of Russia. Ban free speech for everyone who disagrees with me. Anyway, let's read Russia's response. The decisions of the International Criminal Court have no meaning for our country, including from a legal point of view, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, said on her Telegram channel. Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and bears no obligations under it. Lova Belva told Russian media that the arrest warrant reflected appreciation for her work to help the children of her country, that we don't leave them in a war zone, that we take them out. Again, this is the argument that Russian state media is making. This is the argument that Russia supporters are making in response to this, saying, hey, this isn't like a criminal thing. This isn't evil. We're simply protecting the children. But if you were simply protecting the children, you would remove them from the war zone. You would put them in like centers for civilians before transferring them back into the control of the Ukrainian government. But instead, they're taking them away. They're then indoctrinating them before then adopting them out to Russian families. They are stealing the children of another nation. One of the most vile things a nation state can do. Ukraine's president Volodymyr Zelensky estimated the number of deported children at far more than 16,000, and said the warrant represented a historic decision which will lead to historic accountability. It would have been impossible to enact such a criminal operation without the say-so of the man at the helm of the terrorist state. Zelensky's chief of staff said the warrants were just the beginning. Okay, now this goes on to talk about a lot of other people's responses to this and the prospect of Putin's arrest, but let me be blunt with you guys, right? The prospect of Putin getting arrested anytime in the near future is basically zero. He's not going to get arrested. This will be something that further isolates him diplomatically. It's going to be something he considers anytime he visits a country that is an ICC member state, if he even does that now in the future. Most of his time now seems to be spent in a bunker in the middle of Russia at an undisclosed location anyway. So I don't think he's visiting many countries that aren't in his alliance bloc in the first place. I do think this will also make it easier.
Immoral,
morally corrupt, bankrupt man. Couchman 111, thank you so much for the tier 1 and being sub for 15 months. I really appreciate it. This will also make it easier for Ukrainian activists, for scholars studying this war, and people who want to bring attention to the suffering of children internationally, to point to this report, to point to the UN probe, to point to what the ICC said and say, look, right here. Here is respected international institutions accusing the Russian government of this crime and now putting out an arrest warrant for this horrific atrocity. This is no longer something that, people can ignore. This is no longer something that people can just try to sweep under the rug and say, oh, these are just some hysterical Ukrainians crying about genocide again. This is now something that has an international legal basis underneath it. That this is not something that is just rumor. This is not something that just is something that was said in the fog of war. This is something that is happening, and it is being acknowledged to be happening by the United Nations, by the International Criminal Court, by human rights lawyers, by multiple organizations studying this, like organizations in Yale, and I'm really happy to see that there's some attention being brought to this, even if justice for this atrocity is still far, 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 far away, as the Russians continue to brag about doing this war crime on television, saying that they're proud of the work they're doing in kidnapping Ukrainian children. Absolutely despicable.